Good morning to all of you, and let's begin today's lecture. So in the last lecture, we looked at the proof of Rice's theorem, right? Rice's theorem says that if you have a Turing machine, right? So if you have a recursively enumerable language, then finding out whether or not this language satisfies any non-trivial property is undecidable, which means that you cannot, there does not exist another Turing machine, right? Another total Turing machine or another algorithm which can take as input a Turing machine and find out whether or not the language of this input Turing machine satisfies some non-trivial property P, right? And so we proved this by showing a reduction from a problem that is known to be undecidable, which is the membership problem, right, to the property testing problem, right? So this is the problem for which checks whether or not language satisfies a property. Right? So once again, right? So while designing this reduction, we made sure that so this is a reduction from the membership problem to this problem, right? The problem for checking property P. So, which means that whenever an instance of the membership problem, right? So if you take an instance of the membership problem, right, and if this is a yes instance, right, which means that if X, right, in this case belongs to the language of M, then after reduction, right, we come up with this new so the output of this reduction is an instance of this property checking problem, right? So hence it's going to be some Turing machine M prime, and this Turing machine M prime must also be a yes instance, right? So if M and X are yes instances of the membership problem, then M prime should be a yes instance of the property checking problem, right? Which means M prime, the language of M prime must have the property P. Right? And similarly, if M and X are no instances, which means X does not belong to L of M, then M prime should not satisfy the property P. And we ensured this by basically designing this M prime, right, in such a way that uh, if uh, if X belongs to L of M, then this M prime behaves like a Turing machine which whose language satisfies the property P. And if X does not belong to L of M, then this M prime doesn't accept anything, right? So its language is empty, and we assume that the empty set does not satisfy the property P. So that's how. Uh, so that's why we need this property P to be non-trivial. Right? So we need at least one language which satisfies the property and another language which does not satisfy the property. Okay. And so this is the picture of the reduction, right? So this is actually saying that if there were a hypothetical algorithm for the property P, then you could solve the membership problem as well. Right? But since you cannot solve the membership problem, right? Since there is no algorithm for the membership problem, this would imply that there is no algorithm for M prime as well, right? For checking whether or not M prime satisfies the property P. So Rice's theorem, right, is very general, right, because it says that any non-trivial property of recursively enumerable language cannot be checked, right. So therefore, we now have any number of undecidable questions about Turing machines, right. So which is the set of all recursively enumerable languages, right? So you could ask, for example, right, that given some Turing machine, right, which is the same as saying that given some recursively enumerable language, is it a regular language? Right? So is the language of M a regular language? So this is a non-trivial property because obviously there are languages which are regular and there are languages which are not regular as well, right? And it's a property of the language itself. So that's why I can apply Rice's theorem, and hence this becomes an undecidable question. Similarly, is language of M a CFL? Does language of M include any palindromes? Is language of M empty? Does language of M contain more than 1,000 strings? Right? So you notice that all of these are properties of languages and they are non-trivial properties. And that's why I can apply Rice's theorem and say that there cannot exist a Turing machine which can decide these properties, right? So hence they are undecidable. Okay. Right. So let's look at one more problem, which we have seen earlier, right? For other language classes, right? In particular, we saw this problem for regular languages, right? Where we asked whether how to find out whether or not two regular languages are equal. So similarly, we can ask the same problem for the class of recursively enumerable languages, right? So you can ask, given two Turing machines, do they accept the same language? So or do they define the same language? Right? So given to Turing machines, are their languages equal? So this is the equivalence problem. So this is the description of the problem. So I can, of course, write this down in the form of a language, right? So the language would contain the yes instances of this problem, right? So one way to encode this would be as follows, right? So I would say that LE, right? So this is the language corresponding to the equivalence problem, right? And it consists of instances of the form M1, 111, M2. Right? So here, M1 and M2 are both encodings of the Turing machines. And I use the separator 111 in order to separate the encoding of M1 from the encoding of M2, right? Because as we saw earlier, right, that there cannot be three consecutive ones in any binary encoding. So that's how we designed the encoding of a Turing machine. So M1 111 M2 such that language of M1 is equal to language of M2. Okay. Uh, so obviously, I mean, if M1 or M2 are not, for example, valid encodings, right, then I can come up with some fixed strategy, right? So I can, for example, say that if either M1 or M2 are not valid encodings, then they will be present, right, in this particular language. So the first question that you need to ask, right, whenever you come up with such a property, is that can we apply Rice's theorem here? So is this a non-trivial property of the language of a Turing machine? So think about so pause at this moment and think about this for a minute, right? That can we apply Rice's theorem here? Okay. So you will find that the answer is that you can apply Rice's theorem. But in a restricted fashion, right? So Rice's theorem only says about the property of one language, right? So therefore, we need to fix the other language, right? So if we fix M2, right? So let's say that for a fixed M2, right? Then the question that this particular problem is asking is whether or not language of M1 is equal to this language of this fixed M2, right? So language of M2 defines some language, right? And we are asking whether or not, given some Turing machine M1, is its language equal to the language of M2? Right? So obviously it is a non-trivial property because language of M2 itself satisfies it, and any other language won't satisfy that property. So that's why so that's why we can ask this question, right? That so that's why this is a non-trivial property, and hence we can apply Rice's theorem. Okay? So if you apply Rice's theorem, you'll get that yes, uh, this particular problem is undecidable, right? Which is that if you fix M2, then finding out whether or not a language of any other Turing machine is equal to language of M2 is undecidable, right? But the original problem says that for any M1 and M2, right, is the language of M1 equal to the language of M2, right? So now we can sort of so we can actually reduce this problem, right? This problem where we fixed M2 to to the problem LE, right? The equivalence problem. Okay. Because obviously, if I know, so if there is if the problem LE is decidable, right? Which means that for any arbitrary M1 and M2, there is an algorithm which says that whether or not language of M1 is equal to language of M2, then I can use that algorithm to solve this problem as well, right? Where we are fixing the language M2. So that's why so there is a very easy reduction here from the problem where we are fixing M2 to the equivalence problem. And since we know that the problem where we are fixing the Turing machine M2 is undecidable, that means that the original equivalence problem is also undecidable. Right? So yeah, so that's how we can show that this equivalence problem is undecidable as well. However, we can say something more, right? So not only is it undecidable, but it is also not recursively enumerable. So remember that Rice's theorem only says that some problem is undecidable, right? So all problems which are not recursive are undecidable, right? But an undecidable problem can still be recursively enumerable, right? Uh, which is, so for that we define this class of semi-decidable problems, right? So the next question that you have to ask is this equivalence problem semi-decidable? And the answer for that is also no. So it's not even recursively enumerable. And so as one more sort of practice for how to use reductions, right? Let's also show this, right, by reducing from the complement of the halting problem. So there are only a few non-recursively enumerable languages that we have seen, right? So one of them is this complement of the halting problem. The second, so in the last class, right, we also proved that the infiniteness property, right, is also not recursively enumerable. So we could presumably reduce from that as well. But let's see how we can reduce this from the complement of the halting problem. So the complement of the halting problem is the instances of that particular language are of the form M11X, such that M does not halt on X. Okay? And given such an instance of the complement of the halting problem, I need to construct an instance of LE, right? So I need to construct both M1 and M2, right? And I need to construct it in such a manner that if M does not halt on X, then this can happen if and only if the language of M1 is equal to the language of M2, right? So this reduction is actually very similar to the reduction that we saw to prove that the language of a Turing machine, the property, right, that the language of a Turing machine is infinite. Right? So in fact, we construct this M1 to be the same as M prime that we constructed for showing that this L infinity, right, which is the property that the language of a Turing machine is infinite, right? This particular language is non-recursively enumerable, right? So if you remember, right, that the M prime that we constructed for that particular problem, right, it had this property, right, that if M does not halt on X, then its language, right, the language of M prime was actually sigma star, right? Which is the set of all strings, right? So it was basically infinite. And if M does halt on X, then its language was finite. Okay, which means it was definitely not sigma star. So now we can construct M1 to be the same as that M prime. So which means that if M does not halt on X, then the language of M1 will be sigma star. So now I can simply take this M2, right, to be, I can construct this M2 such that its language is also sigma star. Right? So we can take M2 to be a single state Turing machine that simply accepts all strings. Okay? So the language of M2 is always sigma star, right? And the language of M1 is sigma star if and only if this M does not halt on X. Right? So if M does not halt on X, then the language of M1 is sigma star, which means it is equal to the language of M2. And if M does halt on X, then its language of M1 is definitely not sigma star. So which means it's definitely not going to be equal to the language of M2. Okay. So that's it. Right? That is the reduction, and that means that since this problem that M does not halt on X, this is non-recursively enumerable. This means that the equivalence problem is also non-recursively enumerable. So yeah. So uh, this is what mathematically can be shown. Yeah. So Vineet, you have a question?
Sir, how can we create this reduction Turing machine? Like,
Mhm.
how can we construct the M1 string? Like, how will we know that on an input X, will it never halt on M, or will it halt after some long time?
Yeah, so we covered this in the last lecture, right? So basically, what M1 does, right, is that so M1 is given the description of M, right? And it's also given the string X. So M1 will basically simulate M on X, right? But I think we should probably go back to the last lecture, right? Since Yeah, so here is the reduction, right? So given M11x, we construct this M prime, which was the same as which is the same as M1. So what this M prime does, right, is that given some input Y, so M prime takes the input Y, and it's going to simulate M1x for this mod Y number of steps, right, which is the length of the string Y. Okay. So within this mod Y steps, right, if M has not halted on X, then M prime is going to halt and it is going to accept Y. Okay. So what this means, right, is that if M does not halt on X, then it's not going to halt on X for any number of steps, which means that all the strings will actually be accepted by M prime. Right? So that's why the language of M prime will be sigma star if M does not halt on X. But if M has halted on X within some mod Y steps, then M prime will halt and it will reject Y. So this means that if M halts on X, let's say in N steps, right, then you are going to accept, then this M prime is going to accept all the inputs whose length is less than N, right? But for all inputs of length greater than or equal to N, it's not going to accept them. So that's why the language of M, this language of M prime will be sigma star if and only if M does not halt on X. So is that clear? Yeah. Okay. So note that we can also construct this machine, this Turing machine M prime in an automated fashion, right? Since that we can have another Turing machine which will construct this reduction machine, right, M prime, from the description of M. Okay. So we have shown that this equivalence problem is not only undecidable, but it is also not recursively enumerable. So let's look at one more problem, which is the complement of this equivalence problem. So the complement of the equivalence problem is nothing but strings of the form M1, 1, 1, 1, M2, such that this language of M1 is not equal to the language of M2. Right? So here, right? So this problem is clearly not recursive. Right? It's clearly undecidable, and the reason is that we saw this earlier lemma, right, in the last lecture, that if a problem is undecidable, then its complement is also guaranteed to be undecidable. Right? So since we know that the equivalence problem is undecidable, that means that its complement, right, which is this problem, is also going to be undecidable. So therefore, it's clearly not recursive. So we can ask the same question, that is it semi-decidable? So is the complement of the equivalence problem recursively enumerable? Right? So it so happens that for a restricted class of M1 and M2, this problem is recursively enumerable. So in particular, right, if M1 and M2 are both total Turing machines, right, it means that if they are both algorithms, right, so if they are both guaranteed to halt on every input, then this problem is actually recursively enumerable. In sense that you can come up with another Turing machine which will take this M1 and M2, right? And if M1 and M2 are total, then it will be able to determine whether or not L of M1 is not equal to L of M2. So in sense that it will halt, it's guaranteed to halt, right? And except if the language of M1 is not equal to the language of M2. But if it is not the case, right, that language of M1 is not equal to language of M2, which means that if language of M1 is equal to language of M2, then it is not guaranteed to halt. In fact, it will definitely not halt. So this Turing machine that we are designing, right, is very straightforward, right? So there are two different constructions, right? So first is a non-deterministic construction. Okay? So I construct this non-deterministic Turing machine, and what it does, right, is that it simply guesses some string x. So given this M1, 1, 1, 1, M2, at first it's going to guess a string x. Okay? So then this machine is going to have two tapes. Right? So after guessing the string x, so it's completely it will then copy x, right, on these two tapes, right, and then run M1 and M2 in parallel on x. Okay. So since M1 and M2 are total, right, after some finite number of steps, right, it is guaranteed that both of them will halt. Okay. And if one of them accepts and the other one rejects, right, then this machine is going to accept. Okay. So notice that since this is a non-deterministic Turing machine, right? So if if there is a string, right? So if language of M1 is not equal to language of M2, then it is guaranteed, right? That there will be a string X, right? Uh, there will be a correct choice, right, or a correct guess that this machine will be able to make. And if it then simulates M1 and M2 on that particular guess, right, then it will find, right, that one of the machines will accept, one of M1 and M2 will accept, and the other one will reject. And that means that it will actually accept. Okay. So this is a non-deterministic construction, right? So you can also come up with a deterministic construction, right? So in this deterministic construction, you basically enumerate every string in sigma star. Okay. So beginning from epsilon, right? You keep on enumerating every string, and then once you so in this order, right? So in the order of enumeration, right? You first so you first come up with the string, and then you simulate M1 and M2 in parallel on that string, and if both of them accept, right, or both of them reject, then you come up with the next string in the enumeration order, and again repeat the same process again and again, right? So eventually, right, if language of M1 is not equal to language of M2, then you will find a string which is present in one but not in the other, right? But which means that this TM is guaranteed to halt only if language of M1 is not equal to language of M2, right? Because if language of M1 is equal to language of M2, then you will keep on enumerating strings, right? And you will never find a string which is present in one and not in the other. So this is so that's why this particular Turing machine is not recursive, right? Because it is not guaranteed to halt, but it will definitely halt if language of M1 is not equal to language of M2. So, however, if you remove this restriction, right, that so we assume that both M1 and M2 are total, right? But so I should probably say here total, right, instead of recursive, since languages are recursive. Turing machines are either total or algorithms, right? So if either of M1 and M2 are not total, then uh, then the language of then basically this complement of the equivalence problem is not recursively enumerable as well. Okay. So if you remove this restriction that both of them are total, then that means that this particular language will not be recursively enumerable, right? So again, let's again show this by so we'll again do a reduction, right, in order to show this. So we have to reduce from a problem which is known to be not RE. So again, we take the complement of the halting problem. So here is this reduction from the complement of the halting problem. So given an instance of this complement of the halting problem, which is of the form M11x, right, I need to construct this M1 and M2 such that if M does not halt on X, then L of M1 is not equal to L of M2. And if M does halt on X, then L of M1 should be equal to L of M2. So what I do is that given M11x, right, what M1 is going to do, right, is that on the input X, right, so M1 is going to receive some input. So on the input X, M1 is going to simulate M on X. Okay. And if M halts, right, then M1 is going to accept. Okay. But if M does not halt, right, then obviously M1 will also not halt. In which case M1 is not going to accept the input X, right? And for every other input that M1 receives, it's simply going to reject. Okay. So this means that language of M1, right, is going to contain the string X, right? If M halts on X, and if M does not halt on X, then the language of M1 is going to be empty. Uh, and M2 is fixed, right? So what M2 is going to do is that it is going to accept if the input is X. So M2 on its input, right, is simply going to compare it with X. And if it is actually equal to X, then it's simply going to accept it. Otherwise, it is going to reject it. So the language of M2 is always equal to X. So now, right, you can clearly see, right, that if M does not halt on X, then language of M1 is going to be equal to the empty set, right, which means it will not be equal to the language of M2. But if M does halt on X, then language of M1 is going to be X. Language of M2 is always X. So therefore, language of M1 will be equal to the language of M2. Right? So hence this is a correct reduction. Right? So this would imply that this complement of the equivalence problem is also not recursively enumerable. Okay. So note that we needed this restriction, right? That or rather we had to remove this restriction, right? Both of them were total because this m, right, that comes the uh, from the description of or from the description of the LCH problem, right? The complement of the halting problem is also unrestricted, right? So it could be non-recursive, it could be non-total as well. Right? So that's why we have to remove that restriction. So yeah. So are there any questions regarding this reduction? Okay. Okay, so let's kind of summarize, right, in one table, right, uh, what we have done in the course so far. Right? So in the sense that so we have looked at multiple classes of languages. Which in particular, we have looked at four classes of languages, which is regular, context-free, recursive, and recursive enumerable. Right? And we have looked at some general problems, right, or some important problems for languages which belong to the class, right? So these are the membership problem, right, where you ask, right, whether or not some string belongs to the language. So if the language is regular, if the language is context-free, or it is recursive, or it is recursive enumerable, you ask whether or not some string belongs to the language, right? Then the emptiness problem, right, which asks whether or not some language is empty. Right? So when I say some language is empty, right, you don't actually give the language itself. Right? So you give a description of the language, which for a regular language would be any of the descriptions that we have seen, right? DFAs, NFAs, or regular expressions. For context-free language, it could be a grammar or a PDA. Right? And similarly for recursive or recursive enumerable languages, although we have not seen grammars, right? But as I said, right, when I discussed the Chomsky hierarchy, right, that there are unrestricted grammars uh, which can define both recursive and recursively enumerable languages. Right? So you would ask whether or not, given the language description, it is this language empty. Then there is the infiniteness problem, right, which asks whether or not the language is infinite, and the equivalence problem. It says that given two languages, right, which means given two language descriptions, are the languages equal? Okay, so we have seen some algorithms, right, for these different problems for different language classes, and in some cases we have proved that this problem is actually undecidable. Right? So if you look at the membership problem, right, so for regular languages, you simply need to uh, basically execute, right, or run the DFA. Right? So you need to simulate the DFA for the regular language, and you will be able to determine, right, whether or not some string. Right? So if you're given a string and if you're given the DFA, right, you simply run this. You simply execute the string, or you simply process the string using the DFA, and you'll be able to determine whether or not the string is in the language. Similarly, for context-free languages, we have seen the CYK algorithm, right? Uh, for recursive languages, I can again simulate the Turing machine, right, for the recursive language, which means that since the Turing machine is deterministic, right? Uh, I mean, in principle, right, the Turing machine has, or rather, in theory, the Turing machine has infinite memory, but that's fine, right? So you can always add more memory to a practical machine as well. Okay, so this can be done, right, in practice as well. But for a recursive enumerable language, this problem is undecidable, right? So we saw this, right? So we saw that the membership problem, which is the the language of this universal Turing machine, right, that we saw, which is this LU. So we proved that this particular language is undecidable, right? Which means it's actually not recursive, right? Uh, so therefore, the membership problem for RE languages is undecidable. Right? So then the emptiness problem, right, which asks whether or not some language is empty. Okay. So given a regular language, right, I can easily do this, right? So this is so if you're given a DFA, right, you basically just need to check whether or not the final state is reachable uh, in the graphical, right, or the diagrammatic representation of the DFA from the start state. So in the graph representation, of the DFA, whether or not the final state is reachable from the start state. If it is reachable, then the language is not empty. If it's not reachable, then the language is empty. So this is a very simple algorithm for reachability to check the emptiness problem. For context-free languages, we had this procedure, right, whereby we find out, right, whether or not a terminal, or rather a non-terminal in the grammar, can generate terminal strings. Right? So if the start symbol can generate terminal strings, then the particular language will not be empty. And if the start symbol cannot generate terminal strings, right, which means the start terminal itself is useless, then the language would be empty. Right? So again, this is a very simple algorithm to do this. Right? However, for recursive and recursively enumerable languages, right, this problem is actually undecidable. Right? So for recursively enumerable languages, I can apply Rice's theorem, right? Because the emptiness problem is so the emptiness problem is a property. It's a non-trivial property. For recursive languages, well, you can also show that it is undecidable. Right? So if you restrict yourself to just recursive languages, even then the problem is undecidable. So now let's look at the infiniteness problem. So the infiniteness problem is asking whether or not some language is infinite. Right? So for both, so for regular languages, right, when we discussed the pumping lemma, right, we showed, right, that you basically find out, right, whether or not there is a, so given that the DFA of the language, the DFA has n states, and if this DFA accepts a string of length between n and some 2n minus 1, right, or if the language contains a string of length between n and 2n minus 1, then the language is going to be infinite. So this basically reduces to the membership problem. For context-free languages, even though we have not seen this, right, the same procedure actually applies. It means that there you basically look at the number of non-terminals in the CFG, right, and if based on the number of non-terminals, you can check the membership of some finite number of strings, right, and if any of those strings is in the language, then the particular language is going to be infinite. For recursively enumerable languages, again, right, this problem is undecidable because of Rice's theorem, and you can also prove that it is undecidable for recursive languages as well. And finally, the equivalence problem, right, which is whether or not two languages are equal. Right? So here, if you're given two regular languages, right, it means you're given their DFAs, then you can construct their product automaton, right, and then reduce the equivalence problem to the emptiness problem. So therefore, we have an algorithm for regular languages, right? So as it happens, right, for context-free languages, this problem is also undecidable. Right? So although we have not seen this, right, and it's not part of the syllabus, right, because in order to prove this, we need another undecidable problem, which is PCP, the post correspondence problem. So, but using the post correspondence problem, I can prove that this equivalence problem for context-free languages is also undecidable. And similarly, for recursive enumerable and recursive languages, this problem is also undecidable. Okay. Yeah. So I'm just going to briefly introduce post correspondence problem. Right? So this is not part of the syllabus, and you did not actually study this for the exams, right? But so in fact, I'm just going to leave it, right? I'm just going to give an introduction to it, right? And then if you are interested, so the slides will be there, right? So I'm going to post the slides, and you can take a look at it. So, so the problem with all the undecidable problems that we have seen so far, right, is that they are all problems about Turing machines, right? So they basically ask, right, that okay, given some Turing machine, right, does the language of the Turing machine satisfy some property, right, or does the Turing machine does something? Does the Turing machine halt, or the Turing machine not halt? So we need we need a general problem, right, which doesn't really say anything about or which doesn't relate in any way with Turing machines, right? So that is post correspondence problem, right? So PCP is an example of a problem that does not mention Turing machines in its statement, and yet it is undecidable. So in fact, if you look at the statement of PCP, it actually seems very simple and straightforward, right? And you may feel, right, that there should be an algorithm, right, to solve that problem, but as it happens, there is none. Right? So you can never come up with an algorithm to solve the PCB problem. And from PCP, we can actually prove that many other non-TM problems are also undecidable. So as I said, one of the examples that I gave was this equivalence problem of CFLs, right? So you can prove that that is undecidable. Similarly, you can also show that the ambiguity problem is undecidable, and so on. Okay. So I'm going to leave this particular topic here. So it's not part of the syllabus, and but if you're interested, you can take a look at it. Okay, so let's move to the last topic of this particular course, right? Which is the problem of which is the topic of P and NP problems, right? So in particular, intractable problems. Uh, so I think that you will actually study this in much more detail in your design and analysis of algorithms course. But anyway, since this is part of the syllabus, I'm just going to briefly cover it. So we have said that we are interested in problems which are decidable, right? Because for undecidable problems, right, you cannot anyway come up with any algorithm to solve them. Right? But as it happens, right, even for decidable problems, it's not. So even if a problem is decidable, right, uh, in order to practically solve that problem, right, uh, it's just not enough to say that it is decidable, right? Because a problem may be decidable, but if it takes like millions of years for the fastest computer to solve that problem, then it's anyway useless to us, right? So beyond decidable and undecidable, right, there is another sort of boundary which separates problems which can be solved from problems which cannot be solved, right? So this is the boundary of tractable and intractable problems, right? So with experience, right, we found that problems which have an exponential complexity, right, are intractable, in the sense that uh, so they will take millions of years to solve, and they might as well be undecidable, right? Because there is no, I mean, we cannot obtain a solution to these problems in any reasonable frame of time, right? In any reasonable amount of time, right? So therefore, we want to find out, right, whether or not a problem is intractable or a problem is tractable. So for that, we define this concept of a time-bound Turing machine. So remember that now we are interested in time, right? So we want to know how much time it takes to solve a problem. So in terms of Turing machine, right, the time would become the number of steps that the Turing machine takes. Okay? So a Turing machine that given an input of length n always halts within some tn moves, right? So where tn is a function of n, is said to be tn time bounded. Right? So this obviously, if you give a Turing machine a larger input, right, then it will take more time, right? Because it may need to scan the complete input, right? Uh, so in fact, it will take at least n steps, right, to even look at the whole input of length n. Right? Uh, so that's why this number of steps is a function of n, right? And if we can guarantee, right, that for all inputs, right, for all inputs, right, if the length of the input is n, then this Turing machine will definitely halt within tn moves, right? So we are saying it always halts, right? So we are already talking about only total Turing machines, right? Because irrespective of whether or not the input is in the language or not in the language, it should definitely halt. And if it halts within tn moves, then it's called tn time bounded, right? So note that we allow this Turing machine to be multi-tape. Right? So as it happens, right, even if a Turing machine has any number of tapes, right, but some fixed finite number of tapes, uh, the number of moves, right, that are made by such a Turing machine can be or rather the moves of such a Turing machine can be simulated by a single tape Turing machine, right, as well. And the number of steps that a single tape Turing machine would take would still be a polynomial of the number of moves that the multiple tape Turing machine can take. So that's why we allow this Turing machine to be multi-tape. And so the deterministic the multi-tape case roughly corresponds to an order of Tn running time algorithm. So if you can come up with a Tn time-bounded Turing machine for some problem, then it means you basically have an order of Tn running time algorithm for that particular problem. And so now that we have a time-bounded Turing machines, I can define the class P. Right? So if a deterministic Turing machine M is Tn time-bounded, where this function Tn is a polynomial, right, of n, which means it is so it's a polynomial in n. Right? Then we say that this machine M is polynomial time or polytime bounded, and the language of this machine M is said to be in the class P. So so a problem is in class P if there is a polynomial time bounded Turing machine which can decide that problem. And so obviously we are saying about the number of steps which are taken by the Turing machine, right? But when we talk of P, right, so it doesn't matter when we say whether or not we can solve the problem by a TM or we can solve by a computer, right? Because uh, as it happens, right, that computers and there's a polynomial equivalence between computers and Turing machines. Since that if you take if you take a standard, right, uh, single core machine, right, a single core computer, right, then a multi-tape TN can simulate such a computer uh, for time order of Tn in at most order of T square n of its own steps. Right? So if the computer takes some order of Tn number of steps to solve some problem, then the multi-tape Tm will take at most order of T square n of its own steps to simulate those particular steps of the computer. So if Tn is a polynomial, then so is T square n. So that's why we only need to come up with a deterministic multi-tape machine. So Vinit is asking that why will the number of moves from multi-tape to single tape be polynomial? So I mean, I have not gone to details of that, but I think the book covers it in a fair number of details. Right? So it's the HMU book, right, has uh, actually gives a polynomial time bound uh, for that. So what are some examples of problems in P? Right? So we have already seen one in our course itself, which is the CYK algorithm. Which basically solves the membership problem for context-free grammars. So if W is in is W in L of G for a given context-free grammar G, and we saw that the CYK algorithm its running time is order of n cube, where n is the length of the word. And you have seen n number of problems, right, probably earlier as well. So for example, here's a very famous problem, right, for from graph theory, that is there a path from node X to node Y in the graph G? So here the input would be the graph G and the nodes X and Y in G. And you can solve this problem, for example, using Dijkstra's algorithm in order of n log n time, where n is the number of nodes in the graph. So these are problems in P. So they have a deterministic polynomial time-bounded Turing machine which can solve that problem. So the class NP, right? So here for the class NP, we remove this restriction of deterministic. Right? So we look at a non-deterministic Turing machine, right? And the running time of a non-deterministic Turing machine is the maximum number of steps taken along any branch. Right? So remember that in a non-deterministic Turing machine, right? On an input, right? There could be multiple. So on at every step, right, there would be a choice, right? So there would be multiple branches that the Turing machine can take, right? But on any input, right, irrespective of any choice that the Turing machine makes during its steps, uh, if the maximum number of steps taken along any branch, right, so that would be the running time of this non-deterministic TM, right? And if this maximum number of steps taken along any branch is still polytime bounded, then then the corresponding language, right, of that Turing machine would be in the class NP. So if the time bound for the non-deterministic Turing machine along any branch is still polynomial, right, in the length of the input, then the NTM is said to be polynomial time bounded, and its language or problem is said to be in the class NP. Okay. So So here's an example of NP. Right? So obviously every problem in P is also in NP, right? Because so every problem in P has a deterministic polynomial time bounded Turing machine, uh, which is obviously, I mean, it's a sort of degenerate case of a non-deterministic Turing machine because there is only one choice at every step. So obviously every problem in P is also in NP. Right? So uh, here is another problem, right, which is in NP, but it is believed to not be in P, right, which is this knapsack problem. Right? So the knapsack problem says that if you are given some n positive integers, right, from I1 up to In, then can we divide them into two sets with equal sums? So we are basically partitioning this set of n integers into two sets, right, such that the sum of integers in both the sets is equal. Okay. So this problem is very famous because it was one of Richard Karp's original 21 NP complete problems. So there are multiple versions of the knapsack problem, but originally, right, it was specified in this manner. Okay. So this problem is in NP, right? Uh, so why is it in NP, right? Because non-deterministically, right? I can choose, right? So how to design a non-deterministic Turing machine to solve this problem? Right? So you can non-deterministically choose to partition this set of n integers into two sets, right? So and then you can simply check, right, whether or not the sum of the integers in both the sets is equal, right? So you basically sum all the integers in the two subsets and then you compare, and if they are equal, then you are going to accept. Okay. So if I can divide the original set of n integers, right, into two sets with equal sums, then there is going to be then there is going to be some choice which is going to be the correct choice, right? Which means there is going to be some run of the Turing machine, right, or some choice which will lead to acceptance of that particular instance. Right? So and obviously I can so all of this, right, so partitioning the set into two parts and then taking the sum of the integers in both the parts and then comparing them. So this can all be done in polynomial time, right? Because addition can be done in polynomial time, comparison can be done in polynomial time, right? So therefore this problem is in NP, right? So the Turing machine is polynomial time bounded, right? Even though it is non-deterministic. Okay. So this problem of P versus NP, right, was originally just a curiosity of computer science, right? But now it is recognized as one of the most important open problems, right? So is P equal to NP? In the sense that if there is a non-deterministic polynomial time-bounded Turing machine, then does there also exist a polynomial, rather deterministic polynomial time-bounded Turing machine? So there are thousands of problems that are in NP but appear to not be in P. Right? So, but no proof that they aren't really in P. So this problem is still open, right? So there are many problems, right, that are in NP, right? But it seems that they cannot be in P, right? Means that you cannot have a deterministic polynomial time algorithm to solve that problem, right? But there is no proof for that. So when it is asking that is knapsack in P, so knapsack is not in P, or rather it is believed to be not in P. Right? Uh, so there is no definite answer to that question, right? Because uh, it is so knapsack is an NP complete problem, right? So we'll see now, right? What is an NP complete problem? So there is no proof as such that it is not NP, but it is believed that it is not NP. So let's look at this concept of a complete problem. Right? So one way to address this P equal to NP question is to identify complete problems for NP. So an NP complete problem is a problem that is in NP, right? And that has this property, right? That if this problem is in P, then every problem in NP is also in P. Okay? So this means that if an NP complete problem, which has a non-deterministic polynomial time-bounded Turing machine, if it also has a deterministic time-bounded Turing machine, polynomial time-bounded Turing machine, then every problem in NP is also going to have a deterministic polynomial time-bounded Turing machine. So this is defined formally using this concept of reductions, right? But now we are talking about polynomial time reductions. Right? So basically, every problem in NP can be reduced to an instance of the NP complete problem. So this means that if the NP complete problem has a deterministic polynomial time bounded algorithm to solve it, right, then every problem in NP is also going to have a deterministic polynomial time bounded algorithm. So in polytime reductions, the goal is basically to find a way to show that this problem L is NP complete, and we do this by basically reducing every problem in NP to L. But we do this in such a way that this reduction itself is polynomial time, right? So basically, we have a deterministic polynomial time algorithm, right, to basically reduce this problem, so that finally, if we have a deterministic polynomial time algorithm for L, then we will also have a deterministic polynomial time algorithm for any problem in NP. So we need this concept of a polynomial time transducer, right? So this polynomial time, so we saw this concept of transducer in the last class, right? So transducer is a Turing machine that that basically doesn't do that basically doesn't so it doesn't work just as an acceptance and rejection machine, right? So it also converts a string to another string, right? So this polytime transducer will also run in polynomial time, right? So it will take an input of length n, and it will operate deterministically for some polynomial amount of time, and then it will produce an output on an output tape, right? So remember that we want to reduce every problem in NP to a problem in L, right? Which is if you want to show that L is NP complete. So this transducer, right, is going to take an instance of a problem, right, in NP, and it is going to convert it to an instance of a problem in L. Okay, but it will do it in at most Pn amount of time, right, where Pn is a polynomial, okay, and n is the length of the input. So this is a picture of the polynomial time transducer. So it takes as input the the uh, the instance of some problem, right, of length n, and it will convert this to an instance of the problem in L, right, in polynomial time, right? And this is deterministic. And obviously, this polytime reduction has the property of the original reduction, right? So if we say that L and M are languages, then L is polynomial time reducible to M if there is this polytime transducer T, such that for every input W to T, the output X, which is equal to T of W, is in M, if and only if W is in L, right? So basically, we are reducing problems. So we're basically reducing instances in L, instances in M, right? So we say that W is in L if and only if X is in M. Right? So this way, right? If we have a solution, right? If we have an algorithm for M, then we also have an algorithm for L. So this is the picture of the polytime reduction, right? So every instance or every string that is in L is reduced to an instance is reduced to an instant in M, instance in M, right? So this is the instance. So this whole thing is M, right? And this is not of M. So now, right, I can formally define an NP complete problem, right? So a problem M is said to be NP complete if for every language L that is in NP, there is a polytime reduction from L to M, right? So this is a very strong statement to make, right? Because we are talking about every language possible in L, right? So remember, there are actually an infinite and an uncountable number of languages, right, that we present in NP, right? But we are saying that for every language L in NP, there must be a polytime reduction from L to M, and if we can show this, then M will be an NP complete problem. Right? So this M is sort of like then so an NP complete problem becomes like the representative of the NP class, right? Because this NP complete problem is at least as hard as every problem in NP, and if you can find a solution to M, then you have found out a solution to any problem in the class NP. Right? So if M has a polytime algorithm, then L will also have a polytime algorithm. Okay. And obviously, this means that if we can show that this M, which is the NP complete problem, is in T, then every language in NP is also in P, and that would solve the P equal to NP problem. Right? So we have basically reduced this P equal to NP problem to proving that a particular problem, right, is in P. So if we can find out a deterministic polynomial time algorithm for an NP complete problem, then we have solved the question that P is equal to NP. So what is an instance of this NP complete problem, right? So this is a very famous theorem from Cook, right, who said that or who proved that this Boolean satisfiability problem is actually NP complete. Right? So the Boolean satisfiability problem, which is denoted by SAT, right, is this problem that given a Boolean expression, is it satisfiable? Right? So this is a very simple problem, right? So if you're given any arbitrary Boolean expression, right? So remember that a Boolean expression, right, is going to have variables which are Booleans, right? And it's going to have the usual characters, right, and or not, implies, and so on, right? So so the problem is that if you're given some arbitrary Boolean expression, is it satisfiable, right? So is there an algorithm to find out whether or not an arbitrary Boolean expression is satisfiable? So is there an assignment of the Boolean variables that will lead to a true evaluation, right? That would basically uh, lead to a true evaluation of the formula. Okay. And Cook showed that this problem is NP complete, right? Which means that every problem in NP can be polytime reduced to SAT. Okay. So there is a proof for this, right? That if you take any arbitrary problem in NP, then it can be polytime reduced to SAT. Okay. So which means that if we can find out a polynomial time algorithm, a deterministic polynomial time algorithm for SAT, then P is equal to NP. Okay. So now, if once you have an NP complete problem, your task of actually showing other problems to be NP complete becomes simpler, right? Because you only have to reduce from a given NP complete problem to your problem. So to prove that another problem L is NP complete, we only need to provide a polytime reduction from SAT to L. Because I know that every problem in NP, right, reduces to SAT. Okay? So if you can show that SAT reduces to L, right, so then if you have a polynomial, if you have a deterministic polynomial time algorithm for L, then you will also have a deterministic polynomial time algorithm for any problem in NP. So that would mean that you would show that P is actually equal to NP. Okay? So now you need not worry about showing a reduction from every problem in NP to your problem L if you want to show that some problem L is NP complete. Okay? So yeah. So I mean, so this is just a very brief introduction, right, to this idea of P versus NP and the idea of NP completeness, right? So in fact, I haven't even done any examples for that, but that's it, right? So that is the yeah. So that's all I'm going to say about this particular topic. Okay. Right. So with that, so that's basically the end of the syllabus, right? And so there will be no more lectures now, and I've covered the entire syllabus, and so we will have the test, right, which is next week. So it's next Thursday, and so I'm going to release some practice problems for that test maybe tomorrow, right? And then you can solve those practice problems, and if you have any questions, right, then obviously we can schedule a meeting as well, right? And the NSEM exam, right, is still going to be pen and paper, but I don't know when that is going to be. So so that's it, right? So thank you everyone, right? And so I really enjoyed the teaching this course, and I hope that yeah, everyone else, all the students also liked it. Okay, so thank you everyone. So when he's asking when is the test, so it is on May 6th, right, which is the next Thursday. I think I had already, yeah. Okay. Thank you, Vinny. So Vinny is asking that the set of languages in NP will be countable. That's a good question, right? So I don't know actually whether or not it is countable or not. But why would you say that it is? Why would you say that it is countable?
Because we can reduce any language to its binary code, right? Like we can have the Turing machine for that code language, and the Turing machine will have a unique binary
Yes,
code.
yes,
And
I
that will
think
be enough.
yeah.
Any set of languages should be countable. Like I'm not sure, but
Uh, No, any set of languages. No, I mean,
Any set of recursively enumerable
yeah,
languages.
not recursively. Yeah, that's right, right. So yeah, that's right. So recursively enumerable languages, it should be countable.
And
So
in NP problem, we are anyways talking about recursive languages.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, you're right.
Can we say that the set will be countable?
Yes. So because the set of Turing machines is countable, right? So since for every language, right, there is a Turing machine that defines that language, at least for any recursively enumerable language, which is definitely an NP language. So every NP language is recursively enumerable. So that's why you can, yeah, you're right. So you can count it.
Okay, sir. Thank you,
Yeah.
sir.
Yeah. Thanks.